Wood chips curled and fell around Michael Stone's calloused hands as his carving knife sliced through maple with surgical precision. Beyond the workshop's fogged window, a sleek black BMW crouched in Millbrook's early mist alien among the town's weathered pickups. A man in a tailored suit, clutching a manila envelope like a lifeline, stood trembling on the porch. Michael's gray eyes, sharp as flint, met the stranger's haunted gaze through the glass. His knife paused mid-cut. A knot of unease recognition, perhaps dread, coiled in his chest. The man's polished shoes scuffed the worn planks as he approached. "My daughter? She hasn't moved in 6 months," he said, voice breaking through the door. "Raw we bear mus to willy by me anguish and sleepless nights. The doctors say there's no hope left." Michael set the knife down and opened the door, meeting the man's bloodshot, desperate eyes. "Let me help her," he said, voice low but steady. For 2 years he'd hidden in this quiet Connecticut town, crafting furniture and toys, letting the rhythm of woodwork drown out the ghosts that stalked his dreams. Millbrook was a place where secrets sank beneath small-town courtesies and crisp fall leaves. Through the wall, his 8-year-old daughter Emma hummed softly as she prepared for school, her voice the only tether to the life he'd rebuilt from ruins. The air carried the tang of wood glue and the faint smoke of distant fireplaces, scents that clung to his workshop like a second skin. He'd chosen this place to vanish, to become someone new. The stranger, Richard Wellington, stood tall but broken, his once sharp frame diminished by months of grief. His suit hung loose, his hands shaking around the envelope that held his last shred of hope. The BMW's engine clicked as it cooled out of place in this working-class corner of Millbrook. Michael saw it instantly. The hollow desperation of a man with endless wealth, but no power to save what mattered most. "You've got the wrong person," Michael said, but the words rang hollow. He knew Richard Wellington, CEO of Hartford Insurance, his name plastered across New England billboards. More crucially, he knew of the crash 6 months prior, when Wellington's 16-year-old daughter, Sarah, a bright honor student, wrapped her car around a tree in a storm. The news had been inescapable. Wellington's presence meant someone had betrayed Michael's past, someone who knew the man he'd been before Millbrook. Richard's voice sharpened, cutting through Michael's defenses. "I know you were Dr. Michael Stone, chief of neurosurgery at Yale New Haven. You worked miracles before you vanished." His words spilled out urgent, rehearsed, through countless desperate nights. "Sarah's been paralyzed from the waist down since the accident. Every expert says it's hopeless. But I've heard rumors, whispers of your research of patients you saved when no one else could." Michael's jaw clenched as memories flooded back cold and relentless, threatening to unravel the fragile life he'd built. The operating room lights, the delicate dance of scalpel and suture, the godlike feeling of holding someone's future in his steady hands. And then the nightmare that ended it all. The steady beeping of monitors that suddenly went flat. His wife's face going pale on the table he'd sworn would save her. Richard stepped closer, his desperation palpable in the morning air. "I've tried everything. Experimental treatments in Switzerland, stem cell therapy in Germany, acupuncture meditation retreats, faith healers. I've spent over $3 million chasing hope, and nothing has worked. But Sarah, she's not just paralyzed physically. She's given up completely. My brilliant, fierce daughter has just stopped fighting, and I'm watching her die a little more each day." His voice broke on the last words, and Michael saw the raw anguish of a father who'd exhausted every option except this final desperate gamble. "You want to know what doctors can't do?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They can't bring back the dead. They can't undo the mistakes that haunt you every night. And they sure as hell can't promise miracles to broken fathers who think former surgeons can fix what the best hospitals in the world and couldn't. But even as he spoke the words, Michael found himself stepping aside to let Richard Wellington into his workshop. The park at noon was nearly empty, except for a few joggers and an elderly man feeding ducks by the pond. Michael arrived first, choosing a bench beneath a massive maple whose leaves rained down like golden coins with every gust of wind. He'd spent the morning trying to focus on a commissioned rocking horse, but his hands had shaken so badly he'd nearly ruined the intricate mane he'd been carving for weeks. When Richard Wellington appeared walking slowly across the grass, with his shoulders hunched under an invisible weight, Michael noticed he'd traded his expensive suit for jeans and a simple wool coat. The transformation was striking. Without the armor of wealth, Richard looked like any other desperate father clinging to his last thread of hope. He sat down beside Michael without invitation, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out his phone. "This is Sarah, 6 months ago," Richard said, showing Michael a photo of a beautiful teenager with long blonde hair and intelligent green eyes standing proudly beside what looked like a science fair display. She'd just won first place for her project on neural regeneration and spinal cord injuries. Full scholarship to Harvard, wanted to study medicine and change the world. She used to say that every problem had a solution if you were smart enough to find it. His voice caught as he swiped to the next photo. The same girl in a hospital bed, unconscious and surrounded by machines, her face pale and peaceful in a way that suggested she might never wake up. The accident happened on Route 9 during a thunderstorm. Some drunk driver ran a red light and Sarah's car rolled 4 times before hitting an oak tree. She was in a coma for 3 weeks, and when she finally woke up, Richard's voice trailed off as he struggled with the memory. The spinal cord damage was complete at the L1 vertebra. Richard continued falling into the clinical language he'd learned during months of medical consultations. Total paralysis below the waist, no sensation, no voluntary movement, no hope of recovery according to every neurologist we've consulted. But the physical paralysis isn't the worst part. Sarah used to light up every room she entered, used to argue with her teachers about philosophy and debate politics at the dinner table. Now, she won't speak to anyone, won't eat unless I force her, won't even look out the window. It's like the accident didn't just break her spine, it shattered her spirit. Michael studied the photos, seeing not just Sarah's face, but the faces of dozens of patients he'd treated over the years. Young people whose futures had been stolen by random acts of violence, whose families had looked to him for miracles he couldn't always deliver. "What makes you think I can help her when Harvard's best neurologists can't?" Michael asked, though something in Sarah's eyes reminded him of another young woman who'd faced impossible odds with fierce determination. "Because you didn't just treat patients, you revolutionized how we think about neural recovery," Richard replied, pulling out a newspaper clipping yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local surgeon develops breakthrough spinal cord treatment," and the photo showed a much younger Michael accepting an award for innovative surgical techniques. This article is from 5 years ago. It mentions your experimental work with neural pathway reconstruction. Your theory that intensive fine motor training could help the brain create new connections around damaged spinal tissue. The medical community called you a visionary before you disappeared. Michael's throat tightened as he read his own words quoted in the article. Promises about the future of spinal cord treatment that now felt like prophecies from a different lifetime. "That was before my wife Elena died on my operating table," Michael said, handing back the clipping. "Before I learned that vision doesn't mean anything when you can't save the person who matters most to you." These hands that had saved hundreds of lives failed when it mattered most. And I haven't picked up a scalpel since. The confession hung between them like a bridge. Neither man was sure they wanted to cross. Richard was quiet for several minutes, processing what he'd just heard. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen, gentle but insistent. Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person to help Sarah. Not because you're perfect, but because you understand what it's like to lose everything and have to find a way to keep living. Sarah isn't just paralyzed physically. She's paralyzed emotionally, spiritually. She needs someone who knows what it's like to fall from the top of the world and still find reasons to get up in the morning. Against every instinct screaming at him to walk away, Michael found himself nodding. "I'll meet her," he said finally. "But I need you to understand something. I can't make promises about medical outcomes. Whatever I try to do for Sarah, it won't be about surgery or traditional medicine. Those days are behind me." Richard's relief was visible, his shoulders sagging, as if an enormous weight had been lifted. "What would it be about then?" he asked. Michael looked down at his hands. These instruments that had once performed miracles and caused his greatest tragedy, now rough and stained from months of woodworking. "Something I've been learning slowly, one carving at a time," he said. "The art of healing without cutting, of rebuilding, without destroying, of finding beauty in broken things." As they stood to leave, Michael realized he was stepping back into a world he'd sworn to leave behind. The Wellington mansion sat on 5 acres of manicured lawn in Millbrook's most exclusive neighborhood. A Tudor-style monument to success that felt as cold and imposing as a mausoleum. Michael pulled his battered pickup truck into the circular driveway. And feeling like an intruder in this world of marble fountains and professionally landscaped gardens. Through the tall windows he could see glimpses of expensive artwork and furniture. But the house felt hollow, as if all the money in the world couldn't fill the emptiness left by tragedy. A middle-aged Hispanic woman answered the door. Rosa, who introduced herself as the housekeeper and spoke with the gentle authority of someone who'd been caring for this family through its darkest hours. Her eyes held the same exhaustion that Michael had seen in Richard's face, the look of someone who'd been watching helplessly as a family slowly destroyed itself. "Senor Stone," Rosa said, her accent thick, but her English clear. "I am glad you have come. The señorita, she needs someone who understands what it is like to lose everything." She led him through hallways lined with family photos that told the story of happier times. Richard and a beautiful blonde woman Michael assumed was Sarah's mother. Vacation pictures from exotic locations. Birthday parties with elaborate cakes and genuine smiles. Senora Wellington. She died when Sarah was 12. Rosa explained, noticing his glance at the photos. "Cancer like your wife. Senor Richard. He tried to be both parents. But sometimes a father's love is not enough to heal a broken heart." They stopped at the bottom of a curved staircase, and Rosa looked up toward the second floor with worried eyes. "Sarah, she has not left her room in 3 weeks. The physical therapists, the counselors, even her friends from school. She refuses to see anyone." Michael climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a journey deeper into someone else's pain. The house was beautiful but sterile, lacking the warmth, and lived in feeling of a real home. At the top of the stairs, Rosa pointed to a closed door at the end of the hallway. "She knows you are coming," Rosa whispered. "But she may not speak to you. Be patient with her, Senor Stone. She is not angry at the world. She is angry at herself for surviving when maybe she shouldn't have." Through the thin wood, Michael could hear the faint sound of classical music. Something melancholy and beautiful that matched the mood of the entire house. When he finally knocked, the music stopped, but no voice called for him to enter. After a moment, he tried the handle and found it unlocked. Sarah Wellington sat in a state-of-the-art wheelchair by her bedroom window, staring out at the autumn landscape with the thousand-why stare of someone who'd seen too much pain for her 16 years. She didn't turn when Michael entered, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests like she was holding on for dear life. The room was a study in contrasts, expensive furniture and electronics mixed with medical equipment, teenage posters of bands and movies hanging alongside get-well cards that had clearly gone unread. On her nightstand sat a framed photo of a younger Sarah crossing the finish line at what looked like a track meet, arms raised in victory, face glowing with the pure joy of accomplishment. It was a painful reminder of everything the accident had stolen from her. "You can leave now," Sarah said without turning around, her voice flat and emotionless. "I don't need another person telling me how sorry they are, or how I need to stay positive, or how everything happens for a reason. My father's brought a parade of specialists, therapists, and miracle workers through this room, and none of them can change the fact that I'm never walking again." Michael didn't move, didn't speak, just stood quietly in the doorway, studying this broken girl who reminded him so much of himself in the months after Alina's death. The same hollow eyes, the same protective anger, the same desperate attempt to push away anyone who might offer hope, only to snatch it away again. He could see the intelligence burning beneath her despair, the fierce mind that was now turned entirely toward the task of destroying itself. "You're right," Michael said, simply stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "I'm not here to fix you or cure you or fill you with false hope about walking again. And you're absolutely right that everything doesn't happen for a reason. Sometimes terrible things just happen to good people, and there's no meaning in it, except the meaning we choose to create afterward." Sarah's eyebrows lifted slightly, clearly not the response she'd expected from another adult trying to help her. "Then why are you here?" she asked, some of the hardness leaving her voice. Michael looked around the room, taking in the medical equipment, the unused art supplies gathering dust on a shelf, the guitar leaning against the wall with its strings slack from disuse. "Because I think you and I might be lost in the same way," he said. "And sometimes it helps to have company when you're trying to find your way back." For the first time since he'd entered the room, Sarah's mask slipped slightly, revealing a flicker of curiosity beneath the protective anger. "Back to what?" she asked. "I don't know. Yet," Michael admitted, "but I'd like to find out." Over the next hour, they sat in Sarah's room, talking about everything except the accident and the paralysis. Michael told her about Emma, about the simple pleasure of watching his daughter discover the world through 8-year-old eyes. Sarah talked about the books she'd been reading, complex novels about philosophy and human nature that most adults would struggle with. Gradually, the wall she'd built around herself began to crack, revealing glimpses of the brilliant, passionate girl she'd been before tragedy reshaped her world. "I used to paint," she admitted, glancing toward the art supplies on her shelf. "I loved the way colors could blend together to create something entirely new, but my hands shake now from the medications. And besides, what could I possibly create that would matter? What if I told you, I might know a different way to work with your hands?" Michael asked carefully. "Something that doesn't require steady control or perfect technique," Sarah turned back to him with skeptical curiosity. Like what Michael pulled out his phone and showed her a photo of one of his recent wood carvings. A small bird with intricate feather details that seemed to capture movement even in stillness. Wood carving. It's forgiving, patient, and it responds to feeling more than precision. The wood tells you what it wants to become. You just have to listen. Sarah studied the photo for a long moment, and Michael could see her analytical mind working, considering possibilities she hadn't imagined before. "Why would you want to teach me?" she asked. "Because," Michael said, putting his phone away, "I think we both need to remember what it feels like to create something beautiful again." As Michael prepared to leave, Sarah called out to him from her wheelchair. "If I agree to let you teach me, I have conditions. You don't treat me like I'm broken. You don't give me inspirational speeches. And if I tell you to leave, you leave." Michael considered her terms, recognizing the fierce independence that still burned within her. "Deal," he said. "When do we start?" Michael arrived at the Wellington house the next morning carrying a worn leather tool bag and a small piece of basswood. Rosa led him upstairs to Sarah's room, where she waited with a mixture of anticipation and skepticism written across her face. "Change of plans?" Michael announced. "We're not working up here. Grab a jacket. We're going outside." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "I don't go outside anymore," she said quickly. The old defensive walls starting to rise again. Too many variables, too many people staring. Michael set his tool bag down and pulled up a chair to face her directly. "Sarah, I can teach you to carve wood in this sterile room surrounded by medical equipment. Or I can teach you where the craft was meant to be learned under an open sky, with the smell of autumn in the air and the sound of real life happening around us." After several long minutes of internal struggle, Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. "Fine, but if this turns into some kind of inspiration moment, I'm going back inside." The Wellington's back garden was a masterpiece of landscape design, with stone pathways winding through carefully curated flower beds and mature trees that provided natural privacy screens. Michael chose a spot near a small pond where a wooden bench sat beneath an old oak tree, its branches creating a canopy of gold and crimson leaves that filtered the morning sunlight into dancing patterns. He positioned Sarah's wheelchair next to the bench so she could rest her arms comfortably while working. "First lesson," he said, pulling out the piece of basswood, "is about listening. Every piece of wood has a story. Where it grew, what kind of weather it endured, how it lived and died. Before you make the first cut, you need to understand what you're working with." He placed the wood in Sarah's hands, guiding her fingers along the grain. "Feel that? The way the fibers run in long, straight lines. That's the wood's natural structure. Work with it, not against it, and it will reward you." Sarah's hands moved tentatively over the wood's surface, her analytical mind clearly cataloging textures and patterns that most people would overlook. "It's warmer than I expected," she said, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "And it has this subtle smell like growing things, like life." Michael nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. Wood never really dies. It just transforms. Every time you carve it, you're participating in that transformation, helping it become something new." He pulled out a small carving knife with a comfortable wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. "This was my grandfather's knife," he explained. "It taught me that the tool is just an extension of your hand, your intention, your respect for the material. The magic isn't in the knife, it's in the connection between you and what you're creating." For the first hour, Michael didn't let Sarah make a single cut. Instead, having her practice holding the knife and understanding how different grips would affect her control. When Sarah finally made her first cut, the knife slipped slightly, taking off more wood than intended. She cursed under her breath, her face flushing with frustration. "I told you, my hands shake," she said, starting to set the knife down. "This was a stupid idea." Michael gently stopped her. "Look at what you just did. he said, pointing to the accidental gouge in the wood. "See how that changes the character of the piece. What if that wasn't a mistake, but the beginning of something unexpected?" Sarah studied the irregular cut, her artistic eye beginning to see possibilities instead of just errors. "I could work with it," she said slowly. "Make it part of the design instead of trying to hide it." Michael smiled. "Now you're thinking like a carver." Some of the most beautiful pieces I've ever seen came from working around unexpected challenges. As the morning progressed, Sarah began to relax into the rhythm of the craft, her movements becoming more confident with each small success. Over the following weeks, Michael and Sarah fell into a comfortable routine. Every weekday morning at 10:00, he would arrive with his tool bag and whatever piece of wood they'd selected for that day's project. Sarah's skills developed rapidly, her natural artistic sense combining with fierce determination to produce increasingly sophisticated pieces. She carved a small bird, then a flower, then a miniature tree, complete with textured bark and delicate leaves. Each project pushed her abilities further, and Michael watched with growing amazement as her confidence returned along with her technical skills. More importantly, he noticed changes that had nothing to do with carving. Sarah had begun reading, again had started video calling with friends from school, and had even expressed interest in eventually continuing her education. The girl who hadn't spoken to anyone in months was slowly coming back to life. But it was during their third week together that Sarah first noticed something odd about Michael's teaching methods. They were working on a particularly challenging piece when Sarah's knife slipped and nearly cut her finger. Michael's reaction was instantaneous and telling. He caught her hand in his, examined the near miss with clinical precision, checked her pulse and pupil response, and asked detailed questions about any numbness or tingling she might be experiencing. It was the behavior of someone with extensive medical training, not a simple woodworker. "You did that like a doctor," Sarah said, studying his face carefully. "Actually, you've been doing a lot of things like a doctor. The way you watch my hands, the questions you asked about my physical therapy, even the way you positioned my wheelchair for optimal ergonomics." Michael's stomach dropped as he realized his cover was beginning to slip. "I told you I used to study medicine," Michael said carefully, but Sarah's analytical mind was already connecting dots he'd hoped would remain scattered. "Studying medicine and being a doctor are two different things," she replied. "And you have the hands of someone who's done surgery. Steady, precise, completely confident, even when teaching a different skill." She set down her carving knife and wheeled closer to him, her green eyes sharp with curiosity. "My father's been acting strange lately, too, like he's keeping a secret." "What kind of doctor were you?" she asked directly. "And why are you pretending to be something else?" Michael felt the walls of his carefully constructed new identity beginning to crumble, and he realized that Sarah's intelligence and perceptiveness made her far more dangerous to his anonymity than he'd anticipated. The truth was going to come out, and when it did, everything would change between them. Michael stared at the half-carved horse in his hands, its wooden eyes seeming to judge him for the deception he'd been living for months. "I was a neurosurgeon," he admitted finally, "specialized in spinal cord injuries and brain trauma. I developed some experimental techniques for neural pathway reconstruction, published papers that made waves in the medical community." Sarah's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, anger, understanding, and finally, a cold fury that made her look older than her 16 years. "So this whole thing, the wood carving, the friendship, all of it. You've been studying me like a lab rat." Her voice was dangerously quiet. "Were you planning to write a paper about using art therapy on paralyzed teenagers? Is that what this is about?" Michael could see the walls going back up around her higher and stronger than before. And he realized he was about to lose not just her trust, but any chance of helping her heal. "No," Michael said firmly. "The carving is real, Sarah. My caring about you is real. I'm not studying you or planning to publish anything about our work together." He set down his tools and faced her directly, knowing that only complete honesty would have any chance of salvaging their relationship. "I stopped practicing medicine 3 years ago after my wife died during surgery. I performed on her. I couldn't save the person who mattered most to me. So I lost faith in my ability to help anyone. I came to Millbrook to hide, to live quietly, and try to forget what I used to be." Sarah listened with the same intense focus she brought to her carving, weighing his words for truth or deception. "Your father found me because he'd heard rumors in the medical community about my research. He was desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. But I didn't agree to help you because of your medical condition. I agreed because I recognized something in your eyes that I'd seen in my own mirror every morning." What Sarah asked, though, her voice suggested she already knew the answer. The look of someone who used to believe they could change the world, but lost that belief when the world changed them instead. Michael replied, "I saw a potential in you that had nothing to do with whether you'll ever walk again and everything to do with whether you'll find reasons to keep creating, keep growing, keep becoming the person you're meant to be." Sarah was quiet for a long time, studying the wooden horse as if it could provide answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "If you're really a neurosurgeon, why haven't you tried to examine me, evaluate my condition, offer medical opinions about my prognosis?" she asked finally. "Because I'm not your doctor," Michael said. "I'm your friend, and friends don't see disabilities, they see possibilities." For the first time since learning his secret, Sarah's expression softened slightly. "So the carving really isn't medical therapy disguised as art?" she asked. "It's just carving." Michael nodded. "Just carving that happens to be good for the soul." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an unfamiliar voice drifting across the garden. Authoritative professional with the crisp diction of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Dr. Stone," the voice called. "I'm Dr. James Morrison from Johns Hopkins. I need to speak with you about your research." Michael's blood turned to ice water. Morrison was one of the most respected neurologists in the country, and more importantly, he was someone who could expose everything Michael had been trying to escape. "Stay here," Michael told Sarah, but she was already maneuvering her wheelchair toward the house. "Like hell," she replied. "If this involves you, and it involves medicine, it involves me too." As they made their way toward the house, Michael caught glimpses of a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive coat talking intensely with Richard Wellington on the front porch, and he knew that his carefully constructed new life was about to come crashing down. Dr. Morrison was everything Michael remembered, and more. Imposing, brilliant, and absolutely convinced of his own righteousness. He turned as Michael and Sarah approached, his eyes taking in the wheelchair, the carving tools, the obvious closeness between teacher and student. "Michael," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "you're looking well for a man who's supposed to be having a nervous breakdown in seclusion." Richard Wellington stood beside Morrison, looking uncomfortable, clearly unsure how much he should reveal about the arrangements he'd made. "Dr. Morrison contacted me through mutual acquaintances in the medical community," Richard explained. "He's representing a consortium of hospitals and research institutions that are very interested in your previous work." Morrison stepped forward, his gaze moving from Michael to Sarah with clinical assessment. "More specifically, we're interested in your current work. Word travels fast in our circles, Michael. A paralyzed patient making remarkable progress under the care of a disgraced neurosurgeon. That's exactly the kind of story that gets people's attention." Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed them brain scans that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "These are images of your brain activity, Miss Wellington, taken during your most recent MRI. Notice the increased activity in the motor cortex areas that correspond to hand and finger movement. That's not accident. That's systematic neural reconstruction happening in real time." Sarah stared at the colorful brain images, seeing proof that something was changing inside her skull. That the carving wasn't just therapy, but some kind of medical treatment she hadn't consented to. "You used me," she said to Michael, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time, you were experimenting on me, without telling me what you were doing." Michael reached toward her, but she jerked her wheelchair backward away from his touch. "Sarah, that's not—" he began, but she cut him off with a look of pure betrayal. "Don't you dare lie to me again. You're a neurosurgeon who specializes in spinal cord injuries, and you just happen to decide to teach wood carving to a paralyzed teenager." Morrison stepped between them, clearly enjoying the drama he'd orchestrated. "The odds are 0, Miss Wellington, because it wasn't coincidence. Your father specifically sought out Dr. Stone because of his research, and Dr. Stone agreed to help because he saw an opportunity to test his theories without the messy complications of hospital oversight and medical ethics committees." Richard Wellington looked stricken as he realized how his desperate attempt to help his daughter had been twisted into something ugly and manipulative. "That's not why I contacted him," Richard protested, but Morrison was relentless. "The methodology was brilliant, actually. Use art therapy as a cover for intensive neural retraining. Avoid the legal complications of experimental surgery, and if it worked, you'd have proof of concept that could revolutionize spinal cord treatment." Sarah's hands clenched into fists as the full scope of the deception became clear, and Michael watched helplessly as the light died in her eyes. The same light he'd worked so hard to help her rediscover. As Morrison drove away, Michael felt the weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders. Richard Wellington placed a hand on Michael's shoulder as they watched the sedan disappear down the tree-lined street. "I'm sorry," Richard said. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Sarah has been improving. She's been getting stronger, more confident, more like herself again. But now she feels betrayed by the people she trusted most. Michael nodded grimly, knowing that the damage done to Sarah's faith would be much harder to repair than any physical injury. "She has every right to feel betrayed," he said. "I should have told her the truth from the beginning. Should have explained what I thought the carving might accomplish." Inside the house, they could hear Emma's voice as she tried to comfort Sarah, the 8-year-old's innocent attempts to make sense of the adult world's complications. 3 days passed before Sarah would see Michael again. When she finally agreed to meet, it was on her terms. In the hospital conference room with Dr. Martinez, her neurologist present as a witness. Sarah sat in her wheelchair at the head of the polished table, looking older than her 16 years, while Michael took a seat across from her. "I want to know exactly what's been happening to me," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotional storm that had been raging inside her for days. "I want to know about your research, about what you thought the carving would accomplish. And I want to understand what those brain scans really mean. But most importantly, I want to know if any of our friendship was real, or if I was just your latest research subject." Dr. Martinez looked between them, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room, but understanding the necessity of this confrontation. Michael took a deep breath and began explaining his research in detail. The neural pathway reconstruction theory, the experimental surgeries, the promising early trials, before Elena's death had ended his career. The basic premise is that the brain has more plasticity than we previously understood, he said, falling into the clear, precise language of a medical professional. When spinal cord tissue is damaged, the neural pathways that control movement and sensation are disrupted. My research suggested that intensive fine motor control exercises could help the brain create new connections around the damage. Sarah listened intently, her analytical mind absorbing the scientific concepts even as her emotions reeled from the implications. "So, the carving was designed to stimulate specific brain regions?" she asked. "The fine motor control, the visual spatial processing, the hand-eye coordination, all of that was calculated to encourage neural growth?" Michael nodded reluctantly. That was the theory. But Sarah, even if the carving was helping your brain create new pathways, that doesn't diminish what you accomplished. "How do I know what's real?" Sarah asked, the pain evident in her voice. "How do I know which of my feelings and accomplishments are genuine and which ones are just the result of medical intervention?" Michael was quiet for a moment, considering the profound question she'd asked. "Look at what you've created," he said, finally gesturing toward a small carved bird that Sarah had brought to the meeting. One of her recent pieces that showed remarkable skill and artistic vision. Medical intervention might have helped your hands become steadier, or your concentration improve, but it couldn't create the vision that guided those hands, the aesthetic sense that chose which cuts to make, the emotional intelligence that infused that wood with life and meaning. That came from you, from the part of you that existed long before the accident and will continue to exist regardless of whether you ever walk again. Dr. Tours. Martinez nodded approvingly at Michael's explanation, clearly impressed by both his medical knowledge and his sensitivity to the ethical dimensions of the situation. 2 weeks later, an unexpected development changed everything once again. Sarah was working in the garden on a warm spring morning, carving a complex piece that incorporated multiple types of wood, when she felt a strange tingling sensation in her left leg. At first, she dismissed it as phantom pain, a common experience for people with spinal cord injuries, but the sensation persisted and gradually intensified. She called for Rosa, trying to keep her voice calm as she described what she was feeling. "It's probably nothing," she said, though her heart was racing with a mixture of hope and terror. "But could you ask my father to call Dr. Martinez? I think I need to have this checked out." Within an hour, Sarah was at Hartford Hospital undergoing a battery of tests that would determine whether the impossible was actually occurring. The results were unprecedented in Sarah's medical history. MRI scans showed significant changes in the areas around her spinal cord injury. Not healing of the original damage, which remained severe, but evidence of new neural pathways that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. Dr. Martinez called in colleagues from around the region to review the images and confirm what seemed medically improbable. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Martinez told Sarah and Richard as they studied the brain scans together. "There's clear evidence of neural regeneration and pathway reconstruction occurring at a rate and extent that challenges everything we thought we knew about spinal cord injury recovery." The tingling in Sarah's leg wasn't phantom pain. It was her nervous system's first tentative attempt to re-establish communication pathways that had been severed in the accident. Michael received the call from Richard while he was teaching a woodworking class at the community center. A volunteer position he'd taken while navigating the various investigations into his unlicensed practice. His hands shook as he listened to Richard describe the test results, and he had to sit down to process the implications of what he was hearing. "She's not walking yet," Richard said carefully, "but there's definitive proof that neural regeneration is occurring. The doctors think it might be connected to the intensive fine motor training she's been doing with the carving, but they want to study the progression more carefully before drawing any conclusions." Michael felt a mixture of vindication and terror wash over him. Vindication that his theories about neural reconstruction might actually work, and terror about what this development would mean for Sarah's privacy and autonomy going forward. The medical community would descend on her like vultures, each hoping to claim credit for her remarkable recovery. The response to Sarah's unexpected improvement was swift and overwhelming. Researchers from major universities and medical centers contacted the family requesting permission to study her case, offering everything from experimental treatments to research partnerships that could advance understanding of spinal cord injury recovery. But Sarah, now experienced in the dangers of medical exploitation, approached these opportunities with hard-earned wisdom about protecting her own interest. "I'm willing to participate in legitimate research that could help other patients," she told the assembled medical professionals during a family meeting at Hartford Hospital. "But any study involving my case will include patient advocacy oversight, complete transparency about objectives and methodologies, and my right to withdraw at any time without penalty. I won't be anyone's lab rat again, no matter how promising the research might be." Her conditions were met with surprised respect from the medical professionals, many of whom had never encountered a teenage patient who spoke with such authority about research ethics. Morrison attempted to insert himself into the situation by claiming that his previous surveillance of Sarah's case gave him priority rights to study her recovery, but his efforts were quickly shut down by hospital administrators who'd become aware of the ethical violations involved in his approach. More importantly, Sarah's story had sparked changes in how medical institutions handled experimental treatments and patient information sharing. Hartford Hospital implemented new protocols requiring explicit patient consent for any research use of medical data, and several other institutions adopted similar policies in response to the publicity surrounding Sarah's case. The girl who'd been victimized by unauthorized medical surveillance had become a catalyst for systemic changes that would protect future patients from similar exploitation. Her experience had transformed her from victim to advocate, and she embraced this new role with the same fierce intelligence she'd once brought to her academic studies. Michael found himself in the unique position of being both vindicated and cautioned by Sarah's recovery. Medical ethics boards acknowledged that his technique appeared to have therapeutic value, but they also emphasized that his failure to obtain proper informed consent remained a serious violation of professional standards. The resolution was a carefully crafted agreement that allowed him to continue developing his neural reconstruction methodology within academic settings, subject to rigorous oversight, and with absolute requirements for patient transparency. "You've discovered something potentially revolutionary," the head of the Medical Ethics Board told him during the final hearing. "But revolution in medicine must be balanced with respect for the people we're trying to help. Your technique has promise, but your approach needs fundamental changes before it can be ethically implemented." Michael accepted the conditions, gratefully understanding that he'd been given a second chance to contribute to medical science without repeating the mistakes that had cost him Sarah's trust. Sarah's physical recovery progressed slowly but steadily over the following months. The tingling sensations in her legs gradually gave way to more substantial neurological changes, improved muscle tone, reflexive responses to stimulation, and eventually limited voluntary movement in her left foot. He worked with physical therapists who marveled at the unusual pattern of her recovery, which seemed to follow the neural pathways suggested by Michael's research rather than traditional healing progressions. But Sarah approached her physical improvements with the same measured realism she'd learned to apply to all aspects of her medical care. "I'm grateful for every improvement," she told reporters who asked about her recovery. "But I've also learned not to define my worth or my future based on my physical capabilities. Whether I walk again or not, I'm still the same person who can create beautiful things and contribute meaningfully to the world." Her perspective on disability and recovery became a powerful message that resonated far beyond the medical community. The relationship between Sarah and Michael evolved into something deeper and more complex than either teacher-student or doctor-patient. They continued working together on carving projects, But now their collaboration included formal research documentation and regular consultations with medical professionals who monitored Sarah's progress. Michael had learned to balance his desire to help with respect for Sarah's autonomy, always explaining his observations and theories, while making it clear that all decisions about her care remained entirely in her control. "I think of Michael as a partner in my recovery now, rather than someone treating me," Sarah explained during a television interview that aired 6 months after her story first became public. "He shares his knowledge and insights, but he never makes assumptions about what I want or need." That's the difference between healing and manipulation. One empowers the patient, while the other exploits them. Their relationship had become a model for ethical collaboration between medical professionals and patients. Emma continued to visit regularly now, bringing friends from school who were fascinated by Sarah's carving and inspired by her story of recovery. The Wellington house gradually filled with young voices and creative energy as Sarah began teaching informal carving classes to neighborhood children, sharing not just technical skills, but lessons about persistence, creativity, and finding beauty in unexpected places. Rosa watched over these gatherings with maternal pride, seeing how Sarah had transformed from an isolated, angry teenager into a young woman who used her experiences to uplift others. "Señorita Sarah has learned the most important lesson," Rosa observed to Michael during one of his visits. "She has learned that healing is something you do with people, not something that happens to you." The house that had once felt like a mausoleum was now alive with laughter, and the sound of young voices planning their next creative projects. 1 year after their story became public, Sarah received an invitation that surprised everyone. Harvard Medical School asked her to deliver the keynote address at their annual Medical Ethics Symposium. Standing before an auditorium filled with medical professionals, she spoke with quiet authority about the patient perspective, on experimental treatments, informed consent, and the importance of honesty in healing relationships. "Medicine at its best is a collaboration between doctor and patient," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the room. "It requires trust, transparency, and mutual respect. When any of those elements are missing, even the most well-intentioned treatment becomes a form of violation or speech," received a standing ovation. But more importantly, it sparked ongoing discussions about reforming medical education to include more robust training in patient communication and ethical decision-making. Sarah had found her voice as an advocate, and the medical community was listening. Michael attended Sarah's Harvard speech sitting in the back of the auditorium and watching with pride as his former student addressed some of the most prominent medical professionals in the country. Afterward, as they walked across Harvard Yard together, Sarah using forearm crutches that allowed her to walk short distances, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever regret any of it?" Michael asked. "The deception, the publicity, the way everything got so complicated." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the thoughtfulness that had always characterized her approach to difficult issues. "I regret the deception," she said finally. "But I don't regret the outcome. Everything that happened. The carving, the recovery, even Morrison's exploitation, it all led to changes that will help other patients avoid what we went through. Sometimes good things come from bad beginnings, as long as people are willing to learn from their mistakes." As they stood together in the courtyard where future doctors would study and train, both Sarah and Michael understood that their story had become larger than either of them had intended. It was no longer just about a girl who learned to carve wood, or a doctor who found redemption through teaching. It had become a case study in medical ethics, a catalyst for policy changes, and a reminder that healing requires both scientific knowledge and human compassion. Emma, now 9 years old and still visiting regularly, had perhaps understood it best from the beginning. Sometimes broken things can be made more beautiful than they were before, but only if people are honest about what's broken and work together to fix it. The wooden bird Sarah had carved during her first week of lessons still sat on Michael's workshop shelf, its wings spread wide in permanent flight. A reminder that even the most complicated stories can have endings that honor both truth and hope.